All right. Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. Kerstin Hedlund, I'm so excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me today. I'm glad to be with you.
Absolutely. It was really a cool thing to have met you because we met through I started attending Peace Lutheran Church here after having moved to Gahanna, and you happened to guest preach one Sunday and gave this really cool sermon. And I thought, I've never had anyone on who does ministry within the context of the armed services. And so you've got a really cool background. But before we really dig too deep into your story, how did you get into ministry in the first place? For a lot of folks, it's kind of like a second career, or they go back to seminary. What was that path for you?
For me, it was, I guess, the opposite of that, where I almost went not exactly straight through. I had a really short time in the military as an Army intelligence officer before I transferred to the Chaplain Corps. But I would say maybe I was an odd duck early on. I felt a call to ministry and thought I would serve as a parish pastor after getting out of the military. Grew up in the military as an Air Force brat, so kind of had that background as well. But through the chaplaincy, I was able to fuse both a military career and and vocation in the ministry.
That's wild. So you were in the military before that in intelligence. So I mean, there's all sorts of questions now I'm thinking about. But where are the aliens, Kirsten? No, I'm kidding. Only sort of. Yeah. So you found, obviously, what were some of the experiences that you had while serving where you thought, hey, I could really be a service here on the sort of religion side of things?
Again, I think I felt called to the ministry maybe even before the military. And so even as I had that very short period of service trying to transfer, I had wanted to serve as a chaplain. There were chaplains in my life growing up who were just instrumental in my life of faith, and really appreciated their ministry, particularly when we were, again, as a child, as an Air Force brat, living in places that were maybe not really remote, but a little more remote than other places, that the ministry that they were able to provide, the community that they were able to foster, was something that drew me to military chaplaincy. Also, at the time when I joined and became a chaplain, both Iraq and Afghanistan were going pretty hard and heavy. And I had friends who had already deployed. Some of their experiences and some of their stories sort of pushed me to want to be a chaplain, to provide religious and spiritual support to people who were in situations that were pretty sticky and difficult.
Man, I can't even imagine. And we'll definitely get into some stories there. So how would you describe your role? Like, I think one of the good things to establish up front is what is sort of the role of a chaplain for those who aren't familiar with how that works within the military. Like, I think a lot of people are probably semi-familiar with like chaplains as they operate within like a hospital, for example, but not so much maybe within the military. So maybe lay that out for people a little.
Sure. So in the military, we are all assigned, at least I'm in the Army. Every service branch is a little bit different, similar in a way that we're assigned to a unit. In the Army, we're assigned to a unit. And so we live with our soldiers, we work with our soldiers, we eat with our soldiers, especially in a deployed environment. And so we really get to know our people in a way that is, I would say, more intimate than in the parish setting. We're called to nurture the living, to care for the wounded, and to honor the fallen. And so we do that across, full spectrum of operations, both in war and in peace for families. We provide for the free exercise of religion for people, regardless of what their religion is, and we prevent against the establishment of religion within the Department of Defense. So those are some of our central roles. That's a lot right there. You may have some questions. We also advise commanders on ethical implications of operations, or how religion might affect operations. Again, I gave you a lot, so we could kind of unpack some of that.
No, that's really interesting and not something I would have even considered. So when you talk about like sort of ethical implications and specific to, obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of activity, obviously, during the last like decade, within areas that are not, I would say, pretty Christian, but like are areas with high concentrations of Muslim folks, for example. What kind of considerations from an advisory role are you making when soldiers are interacting with people in those geographical areas?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and this is not necessarily a chaplain specific, but what your question just raised this up for me. There was a period of time when women were not in special forces, and the military decided, particularly in Afghanistan, that it might be a good idea to have women serve in special forces roles because of the cultural, just ways of being in different environments, that males had a harder time, breaking into communities that had a high population of females, and maybe females had some influence in the surrounding villages. And so to have to have women be able to engage that way. And sometimes chaplains were able to say, hey, these religious and cultural implications, or the way that we're doing operations, maybe we should look at it from a different angle. Another thing that chaplains do sometimes is where we also have intelligence officers and civil affairs officers, but just knowing sort of the rhythm of religious life in different parts of the world and saying, you know what, maybe it wouldn't be a good idea that all of our soldiers come into this village at this time because there is a religious event going on. Could we wait 48, 72 hours before we go in? And the way that that's going to appear to the local population may land a lot better.
Yeah, that's sort of along the lines of exactly what I was kind of wondering, is just the considerations that you may take in regards to the fact that, some of these societies, like religion, is at the forefront there. As opposed to, American society, which is a little bit more diverse or secular, where maybe that's not as much of something that you might have to think through before going in.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that we do as chaplains, we call it a key leader engagement. Again, particularly overseas, in overseas operation, where you may be in a community or town or village that is ruled by a religious leader rather than some kind of political leader, in the way that religion and politics play together. Sometimes those leaders will respond better to another quote unquote religious leader, even if that's not from their tradition. And commanders may bring a chaplain along with them as they're having conversations with the local leaders, because of the way that religion is so influential in those kinds of communities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You kind of look back. I'm a history nerd, so I think back to the ways in which we may have handled things differently in the past and just sort of kind of barged in, maybe,
Yeah.
and how that plays out. So it sounds like, there's a lot more study and thought involved, in modern times, just in regards to how religion does play such a major role in so many societies that we may interact with in a wartime setting.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And for the soldiers we serve as well, and their families.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about that. I think that's one of the most interesting things for me is just the fact that I can only imagine, I've got friends and family members who all have served at various times and in various capacities. And some I had a very sort of, you know, um, experience that was sort of mundane, and then others who saw the worst of the worst. And for those who see the worst of the worst, I can only imagine, we talk a lot about on this podcast about the different scenarios in which you might find yourself deconstructing your faith and sort of reconstructing. One of those things I can only imagine that might throw you onto the path of deconstruction would be seeing some of the horrors of war and starting to ask questions and starting to sort of question maybe your faith that you grew up with once you see, just I think, well, I can't remember who the general is now, but famous quote is "War is hell."
Mhm.
So talk maybe a little bit about some of your experiences with that and sort of trying to help minister to those who are really have gone through the worst of it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something I guess we could spend a lot of time on. And there are other chaplains who have had experiences very different than mine, and other soldiers who have had very different experiences than my soldiers. I guess coming from my background, I'm a Lutheran. That doesn't mean that I serve only Lutherans. I serve all soldiers and try to get them the care that they need, whether it be from me or from another chaplain. But I guess core to my own religious identity is kind of this idea of God rising in the places where we don't expect God to be, and somehow out of the ashes, something new rising, and trying to translate that key component of my faith to soldiers who have been through some of the worst, in order to give them some hope for the future, despite what has been done to them, or despite what they have done. I I may be sidetracking, but I remember serving in a prison one time. This was after deployment, and after the deployment of several soldiers. Some of them had served in Afghanistan in a unit that had unfortunately conducted some war crimes that were pretty horrific. And a lot of them were younger soldiers who I think weren't fully aware of the implications of everything that they were doing. And here they were in prison, kind of wondering about what their future would be in the military, beyond, and in life. And having the opportunity to come together with them and share worship services, share sacraments. There was a time when one soldier who had wronged the other soldiers and was the reason why they were in prison, I inadvertently asked him to share communion, happened to be on Ash Wednesday. And here he was, who had done wrong things to people overseas and to these soldiers, offering them the body of Christ. And I thought, there's going to be a prison riot in here. Why did I do this? But every single soldier went up to him with tears in their eyes, and he with tears in his eyes, as he offered them the sacrament. And at least in that moment, I felt a sense of reconciliation. A soldier had come up to me and he said, I had been hiding the truth about what had happened for a really long time, hoping that I would have a future. And now I'm waiting in this prison, wondering what that might be, but I've never felt more free in my life. And having the opportunity to have those honest conversations, not knowing what the future would be, but knowing that somehow it rests in something larger than all of us, gives me hope for continuing on. And at least, again, in that instance, gave him hope. He was, after trial, eventually released from prison and able to move on with his life in that case. But those are the kinds of stories and the kinds of people, maybe not necessarily fully deconstructing my faith, but opening me to evaluate it in new ways, and I hope I them.
Yeah, that's a story that really hit hard with me. I know you told that, when you
That's
were
right.
and definitely had a few tears going, in my seat, in the back there. But it's such a powerful story. And I guess, not just from your perspective, but from, the soldiers themselves, witnessing these horrific things, and potentially going through their own deconstructions.
Yeah.
you know, how do you approach folks like that? And what sort of role does your ministry take in those cases?
I think allowing space for everybody to do his or her own deconstruction, not trying to force my own beliefs upon them or force a path that quote unquote might be helpful for them because it worked for me or worked for somebody else, but allowing the space for the soldiers to question, to lament, to wonder, and I hope to hope is an approach that I take, always welcoming everybody to whatever I have to offer, but not pushing it pushing it upon them, particularly for those who have done things that they wish that they hadn't done, also not offering any kind of consolation that might be too soon or too early for them. I remember listening to a documentary by Martin Doblmeier, I think, on chaplains. And there was a chaplain who said, as he was talking with a soldier who had done something, the soldier had done something that he wished he hadn't done. And the chaplain saying, well, did you follow the rules of engagement? Did you follow the rules of this particular operation? And the soldier said, I did. And the chaplain saying, okay, well, then you're good. I think in conversations, I haven't had a situation exactly like that I wouldn't necessarily offer that to the soldier if he or she feels in their soul that they're not good, to allow them the space to say, we're all part of this complex world, complex operation. And sometimes we're called to do things that we couldn't or shouldn't do. And how do we reconcile with that, knowing it's not fully our fault, but we're all somehow implicated? Having allowing space for those honest conversations, I guess, is my approach. That was a very long-winded response to your question.
No,
I
no,
guess it's
that's great.
situational, contextual.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think back to, I watch a lot of like documentaries myself, and it brings to mind some of the documentaries about some of the soldiers who came back from Vietnam who, in large part, again, a lot of these guys were young, they were kids, teenagers who were just following orders, but in some situations did some pretty horrific things, like,
Yeah.
in hindsight, and who are damaged forever, returning back to the United States. And so often, I think one of the frustrating things for me personally is seeing my friends who just don't seem to be getting the level of care upon return that they so desperately need. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like what happens when soldiers come back to the United States and are trying to reacclimate to life. What role does chaplaincy maybe serve there?
Yeah. And that's a really good point too. When soldiers come back, kind of the reacclimation, and in recent operations, it's been almost whiplash, where you're in theater one day and home so quickly thereafter. Whereas even in World War II, there was a period of time coming home, oftentimes on a ship, where you have sort of this cleansing period of sorts with other soldiers before going home, and it's so quickly. Um, the military does offer these soldier readiness programs, yellow ribbon programs, where soldiers come back together after being in theater after different periods of time. It varies. Sometimes it's 90 days after everybody comes together and has an opportunity to receive care from chaplains and also from other kinds of mental health support, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. There are always chaplains back at the mobilization site and the demobilization site. So when soldiers are leaving for theater and coming back for theater, it's required that they all come to see a chaplain. I would say it's not necessarily the most effective way of doing things, but it does remind the soldiers that the chaplains are there at least. And then having the unit chaplains offer times for soldiers to come back together again within the unit to do some debrief type of events is another thing that we offer. And kind of knowing what some of the opportunities are outside of the military, because sometimes soldiers and airmen, Marines don't want to receive care from chaplains because of what we represent just being part of the military. And there are other programs. My brother-in-law works with, I think it's called Healing Waters. Tom Brokaw was big in that. It's a fly fishing retreat for people. There are other different types of retreats that many of them are free for service members. And so knowing your soldiers and what might help them, they might not want to receive care from you, but maybe something outside of the military would be helpful. Again, like Healing Waters, to give soldiers opportunity to decompress, to deconstruct, to reconstruct, and to heal.
Yeah, that kind of is a perfect segue into my next question, which is how has serving in the military shaped your understanding of community and belonging? Because there is a very different style of community within the military. You're in tight quarters oftentimes, and I remember reading about post World War II, the boom of like fraternities and sororities, because there was this sort of a lack, of like this brotherhood that existed, and so they created like moose lodges and all these different organizations so they could continue to have that sort of community and camaraderie. So what has the military taught you about that type of thing?
I would say that the military has taught me the importance of community. We're really big on, checking in on each other and making sure that we're okay. I have friends in the military with whom I haven't spoken in years, and all of a sudden they say, "Hey, I'm in the area. Can I come spend the night at your house?" And the door is open. Or I know a friend of a friend who's passing through your way. You've never met him before, but could he come over? And I feel like we do have this brotherhood, sisterhood of soldiers that is deep and tight. Again, because we are only together for short periods of time. Sometimes we really make the most of getting to know each other as best we can and kind of seizing the opportunity to learn from each other, to grow from each other, and to know that our lives could truly depend on each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can only imagine that although short periods of time, it's very condensed. You're again living together. And I remember a friend of mine served in the Air National Guard and was over in Kuwait, and when everything kicked off and was sort of just helping soldiers, again tight quarters, but sort of
Yeah.
helping provide some level of entertainment, while they sort of waited for their I can only imagine it's a very like almost like a what do they call those? Like an abridged course, in college where it's same amount of material just shoved
Yeah.
into.
And like an intensive course, right?
Yes. That's what I think of.
Yeah, it is, particularly again when you're mobilizing or deploying. Those relationships that you make with people are very, very deep and tight. And when you talk about community, I don't know why this comes to mind, but I remember in training, I was in ROTC, and we have these packing lists in the military. And why do we all have to pack our backpack the same way? As long as I have all of my stuff in my backpack, why do you care if it's in this pocket or that pocket? And I learned that if I were to get hurt and I needed something quickly, the person to my right or to my left would know exactly where my first aid kit was, exactly where my food was, because we all have our packs packed in the same way. And so some of these things that we do in the military that we within the military or even outside of the military think, oh, well, that's dumb. It's just conformity. Some of it's more than conformity, but it's about survival and about knowing how to serve each other and serve each other efficiently.
Yeah, I was going to say that's just sheer efficiency right there. That's fascinating. Talk a little bit about, obviously, you served during a time of war where we were in a couple different countries. What has it taught you, and what have you seen in regards to human resilience and meaning making through your work?
And a lot about human resilience and finding maybe a purpose within a purpose, whether or not one believes in the operation that he or she is engaged in. How do I find a purpose within a person? How do I love the community to which I have been given for right now. And one of the things I learned, I think I really learned was that, and we all know this to some degree, but I think we forget it so much, is that things are not always as they seem and as they are portrayed on the media. And so, for example, when I was in Iraq during the time of withdrawal, we were finding that the base on which I was primarily serving was getting mortared by some of the surrounding villagers a lot more heavily. And we had really gained good relations with the local community. So it's like, why are we getting mortared now more heavily as we're withdrawing? And what we found out was that obviously this great influx of service members is boosting the local economy, and these people who had been used to having so many people in the area for decades, now there's this great withdrawal. And what does that mean for them, and how do we tell you that I love you? Well, I'm telling you that I love you by throwing a mortar at you, because this is the only way that I can see to get you to stay, from that perspective. And so again, kind of, there were other examples too, but I'm going to throw a mortar at you because I like your presence. That might not be the way that other people understand it. So again, getting to know the story within the story. We also had a lot of people that we called third country nationals. And Cam Simpson, I think he's a British author. He wrote in Chicago, wrote a book. It was called The Girl from Kathmandu. And I feel like I met a lot of people who are sort of representative of this girl from Kathmandu, people from countries that were considered two-third world's countries, who were coming into theater not necessarily thinking that this is where they were going to go, almost human trafficked in a way by private companies. And the resilience that they had and the faith that they had in very helpless and hopeless situations also taught me a lot about human resilience, about overcoming obstacles, but also about persistence and needing to get hidden stories out for the lives of human brothers and sisters across the globe who need it.
Yeah, I want to offer an opportunity for you to kind of share some of your the stories and experiences that were most profound to you. But one of the things I want to make sure I ask you before we get into that piece, you mentioned the diversity, and obviously we have a very diverse group of in the military, all different races and religions and non-religion and everything in between. As you know, and again, I'm a proud Lutheran boy myself, and I always tell people, I'm like, my religious upbringing within the Lutheran Church, specifically ELCA, was very non-traumatic. It was very non-pushy, non-judgmental. I remember sort of hearing about the concepts of heaven and hell and all this stuff, but that was never at the forefront. It was always something like, hey, it's somewhere back here.
Mm.
It was more at the forefront. I felt, this is my personal experience growing up as a child in the Lutheran Church and the son of a ELC Lutheran pastor, was very much sort of encompassed in that old hymn. They will know we are Christians by our
By
love.
our love.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that I influenced Doug to make that song happen a couple weeks ago in church, but because I told him the same thing, I'm like, that's to me when people ask, what does it mean to be an ELC, a Lutheran? I'm like, to me, that's it, man. Like it's you walk through life leading with your heart and
Hmm.
live out the gospels and the love of Jesus, and that's the way that we interact with others and share that good news is just through our actions, is just being a good human being, uh, and not pushy and trying to convert everybody and scare the shit out of them. It's not our style. So having said that, as a Lutheran chaplain, I would imagine that your approach is maybe a little different than others. That you kind of hinted at that before. Being surrounded by just sheer amount of diversity, how does that sort of like change your approach? I guess when you're sort of interacting with such a broad array spectrum of people.
Yeah, I think again, getting to know where other chaplains are coming from and where soldiers are coming from, kind of knowing the context. I don't know that, I'd have to think more about this, that being with a broad array of people, necessarily changes my approach, even within the chaplain corps, despite our religious tradition. All of us are kind of taught about the chaplain is almost exactly what you were talking about, just this ministry of presence, and our actions for our soldiers, our caring for our soldiers, regardless of what their faith background may or may not be. and being there in the trying to go to some of the darkest places with them so that they know that they're not alone, in hopes that somehow that brings people hope and shows them love. And having said that, knowing my chaplains to my right and left also is super helpful, because there may be soldiers who don't like having a female clergy person, and I need to honor that. And so I can refer those soldiers to somebody else that I know who from whom they can receive the care that they feel that they need. So that's I guess that's part of my approach, and the approach of many chaplains is to know from whom do our soldiers feel comfortable receiving care? And if it's not from me, who would be a good point of contact for them?
Yeah. Yeah, and this kind of leads to my next question, which is, I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, maybe it was before we started recording, but my dad, also an ELC Lutheran pastor, but was a hospital chaplain for a good stint during his career. And so I think about like his work as a hospital chaplain. I remember thinking once, a really good friend of mine from high school, we had just moved to another city about an hour and a half away. And I get a call one night that says, "Hey, your friend Jason's at the hospital here." I'm like, "What is he doing here? This is an hour and a half away from where we grew up."
Yeah.
And come to find out, it was this awful situation where he had an older cousin who was probably a couple decades older, who had been in this terrible motorcycle accident. And it was the first time I got to see my dad in action as a chaplain, and it was just an awful, just the worst situation you can possibly imagine. This guy's parents were there, obviously Jason and his family were there, the cousins, this gentleman's girlfriend was there, and the parents had just lost their other child a year prior to cancer. And now, my dad and the surgeon had to come out and tell them they had lost their son as well. And just to hear, it's a different level of crying if you've ever heard somebody who's lost the love of their life. It's awful. It's awful. And I've heard myself before when my mom passed away from cancer, and it's just not something you ever want to experience. But sitting there, I remember thinking, how does my dad do this? Like, how? And now he's got to go talk to him about organ donation. Like, what? Like, no. And so I hear these stories and I think, man, I could never do that job. I just couldn't. And so then you think about sort of that role. And then you think about the care that pastors have to give on a regular basis. But then you think about all of that and you're like, man, their worst day is nothing compared to potentially what an army chaplain has to go through, where you're encountering people whose friend was just shot in front of them, or a mortar went off, or, a IUD or something. And they're seeing just next level, in terms of things that are just horrifying. And so not only do you as a military chaplain have to deal with the normal stuff, the day-to-day stuff, but you're having to deal with this whole level as well. And so as a military chaplain, what would you say you would want civilian faith communities to understand about military life and spirituality? And what are some things that maybe we could do better on the civilian side, that, some things that you've taken away from your career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you just, in your example, it's just a reminder that everybody goes through um, trauma and just unthinkable situations. And some in the military, as you said, more pronounced. I did say that there are some times when military people who have been through some of these traumatic situations, or have been felt as if they were forced to do something that they didn't do, don't want to receive care from military people, but rather from the civilian community. And then there are situations, as you're talking, that sometimes, as much as the civilian community may want to offer assistance, that there are some things that military people may only want to receive from other military people. But I think with the civilian community, giving military people space and honoring their service in a meaningful way is a gift that the civilian community can give to people who have served, again, because of some of the traumatic experiences that they've encountered um, on behalf of the civilian population. Is, as you were talking about your dad's experience, as a military chaplain, for me, I feel like it was easier in some of those more traumatic moments with the soldiers than it was to go back to families to give the word. I mean, part of our role too is if there's a casualty, um, that the family has somebody notify them in person within 24 hours if somebody has died, in theater or in the military in some way, shape, or form, and knocking on the doors sort of coldly into, and entering the home of a mother, um, or a father or a wife or child. Those were some of the more difficult than even being in that moment of trauma, just because of the I've used the term whiplash already today, but that complete whiplash of somebody going on with his or her life, hoping for the best, and then here stands this person before them with some horrific news.
Yeah, I remember there's a series of podcasts I just became aware of, um, produced out of the UK. And there's this famous English actor who does the narration. It's really wonderfully done, but they do a lot of historical podcasts, and I was listening to several of them. They do one on the Titanic, and so I was just listening to one on D-Day, and they talk about the fact they share the story of this one soldier who told his sister, like, if I forget who the agency was back then who would do the notification, like one of the postal agencies or whatever. But he like, look, if you see individuals from this agency show up at the door, like you have to answer the door. Mom and dad cannot. Like you have to be the one to deliver this news.
Mhm.
I don't want them finding out from, from just this knock at the door. And yeah, that I can't even imagine having to deliver news like that. Yeah, in some ways, like it feels like it's would be somewhat easier because the soldiers who are serving together go in knowing that there is that risk, there is that possibility. Whereas family members were at home just praying to God that like they come home safely.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I should what and I one of the things I guess I should note about that with the casualty notification, not that we need to get all into this detail, is that a chaplain always accompanies a notification officer, but the chaplain is never the one who actually delivers the news. And I think that the military set up that system um, for a reason. And I think some of that has to do with construction and deconstruction of faith and what each person represents. So just an interesting piece of information with that notification.
But what an awful job though. Good grief. So like having said all this the fact that the dark reality of it is that these things do happen. The things that keep you grounded personally, how do you stay grounded amongst this sort of demanding role? Like how do you do that?
People around me, other soldiers themselves, just bring me a lot of life and joy. As you said, the military is a very diverse organization, so it's a group of people that I probably never would have encountered had I not been in the military, and learning about different cultures and religions and ways of being and food gives me a lot of joy. The senior chaplains and junior chaplains who serve with me to my right and my left and carry me when I feel like I can't go further, and I hope I carry them, also gives me joy. And just knowing some of the stories that and encounters that kind of reveal, I guess, the presence of something holy in the midst of something that um, may not look holy, also gives me a lot of hope and joy. As I a little bit mentioned, these people from what we called third country nationals, but people from the two-thirds world coming into theater. I remember there was an Air Force priest who had befriended me and I befriended him, and we served together in Iraq. And the way that he invited me to join in Mass, and the way that he invited all these people from all of these different countries to join in Mass, and being in this kind of shack of a chapel under, around concrete T walls to protect from mortars, with a roof overhead for protection too. But seeing, it was almost like a glimpse of John's vision in Revelation when he says, "Then I saw every tribe and every nation gathered around." Was it really? But it gave those moments of all of these people from around the world coming together to celebrate with this Nigerian priest. And getting the opportunity to hear their stories, it's like, wow, this is a glimpse of what I imagine heaven may be like, even if we're in the midst of hell right now. That is something also that keeps me going, holding on to those people and those experiences.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of innate sort of community in just within the chaplains, despite the fact that maybe you come from a different like stream of Christian thought. Like there's got to be some, sort of built-in camaraderie there where, you kind of speak the same language. And so, a lot of ways.
Yeah, and even beyond the Christian tradition as well, the opportunity to serve with Buddhist chaplains and Hindu chaplains and Jewish rabbis is something that I've had in the chaplain corps in a way that I don't think I would have had in parish ministry, and that's been really, really fulfilling as well.
That's really cool. Yeah, I talk I talk about I took some seminary courses, and one of them was a like a world religions course. And I know people who've listened to this podcast are probably tired of me talking about it, but it was such a moving experience. It was such a big experience for me personally. Like I've always been sort of open to learning about everything, but just had never taken the opportunity or never really had a I guess a good reason to or an invite, I guess, to go experience another form of worship. I went to a Hindu temple and like it was so moving.
Yeah.
I the temple priest for like 3 hours. He hands me like a handful of mandarin oranges that at first I panicked because I thought, is there some because we're supposed to prep before we go in and be sure we're not offending people. So
Yeah.
I took the shoes off, put it in the cubby when I went in and was trying to be as anonymous as possible. But when you're the tallest, palest guy there, like you kind of stand
Stick
out.
out.
This sweet little woman comes back. She's like, "Can I help you?" Like looking at me kind of concerned, like, "What is this guy doing here?" And when I told her, I said, "I'm just here to learn and take notes and kind of take things in for a course, I'm taking." And she welcomes me in and says, "My husband's a temple priest. He had just finished up some readings." And she's like, "Come, come, come, come." So he hands me all these mandarin oranges, and I panic because I thought, "Is this part of like some ritual I was supposed to know before I came in here? I should know. I'm supposed to know what to do with these." And it was just an offering, like a gift, a snack. And I thought, how sweet. And then he's like, what do you want to know?
Aw.
And
Yeah.
we sat best conversation, and it was not like, your typical Western evangelical experience where they're immediately trying to convert you or like, tell you about how all of your, the things that you believe are wrong. It was very much like a seek to understand and like, hey, like, so you believe this, right? And this is kind of what we believe. And here's sort of where we meet in the middle. And here are the things that are different. And what else do you want to know? And
Yeah.
and he was just like at the end, it was like the epitome of like welcoming someone to the table. And
Yeah.
literally with that, he was like, we have this big feast
Yes.
every Sunday. Like, you're more than welcome to come bring some friends and we just sit and eat and talk. And I was like, yes, I love Indian food. I'll be there.
That's fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That kind of reminds me there were, as you were talking, two kind of army stories that came to mind as well. That I was traveling with my commander to, it was kind of the Iranian border, to an Iraqi base where some of my soldiers were, and I was going there to provide communion for them, any kind of counsel that they might want. But I knew as I was going, I was this young white Western female Christian cleric, and it was an Iraqi base. How is Colonel Allah, the Iraqi 60-year-old Middle Eastern Muslim, going to accept me? And typically women don't sit at the table with men, but he invited me to dinner with all of his officers. I sat at the table with him. He invited me into meetings, and like you, I was careful to do what I needed to do not to offend. I remember making sure my feet were on the floor because showing the bottom of your foot is disrespectful in Iraqi culture, and don't cross your legs so that the bottom of my foot shows. When we left though, he said to me, he said, "Why don't you stay here and be our imam?" And I knew he wasn't asking me to be something that I wasn't. And he was, half joking but half serious. He said, "Because we don't have a religious leader here, so would you stay?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go with Colonel Spry, my commander." And he said, "Well, pray for us then." And he's looking me dead in the face. "Just pray for us then, because I know that Allah always hears the prayers of the faithful."
Oh,
And for him to tell me that, it's something I've obviously carried for many years that I'll never forget. Just his
God,
grace and his welcome.
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I wanted to, like I said before, I wanted to offer time at the end for you to kind of share some of the stories like that were so impactful for you in your career. And so, yeah, any other stories that you would like to share?
Oh, well, again, though, because I feel like this kind of opened up, this isn't my story. It's a story of a friend of mine. He was actually one of my supervisors. He was serving in Afghanistan, as we're kind of talking about faith and these divisions that are breaking down. But it was around Easter time. He was serving in Afghanistan. He was in the dining hall, and he said there was a commotion. I wish he were here to tell it, because he would tell it so much better. Maybe one day you'll get to talk to him. Somebody said they need the padre. And he goes out to the gate. He said he was terrified that there was all this commotion out at the gate, and there was a guy from from who had gone into Pakistan who came with a package for him. And there's lots of shouting, lots of commotion. He said it was a couple days before Easter. And this man is standing with the package right outside the gate and telling him, "Come outside of the gate right now. I have this package for you." And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I am going to," some people were going to walk out with him. And he said, "No, he has to come. He has to come alone." And so he's terrified and he's stepping out. And the guy is holding this package and he says, "Tell me who your God is. Tell me who your God is." And he's like, "The God of Abraham." And he's trying to find this commonality. And he's like, "No, well, tell me who you confess." And he's like, "The same God as you, the creator of the universe." And he's, "No, tell me." And he hands him the package and he says, "Open up the package right now." And my friend opened it up and it was a Pakistani New Testament. And he said, "Happy Easter to you, Pastor." He was not Christian, but he had gone up into the mountains to a village far away to find this New Testament to give to this religious leader who he knew as the Padre as an Easter present. And my friend thought he was going to get blown up, but he was blown away by the grace of this gift.
Gosh.
Yeah, and I wish he were here to tell the story because he tells it a lot better, but that's the gist of it.
That's incredible. And I think that's like the human story in all of this that sort of gets lost as we're sort of fighting these battles that oftentimes, kind of pull in people who are not too dissimilar from us, if we really got to know them. And it's just unfortunate that, the powers that be, are fighting over land and resources and things. And yet, we hear stories like this where there are these just beautiful people interacting and sharing these beautiful moments amongst one another in the most, unlikely of places.
Exactly. Yeah. And finding that commonality, not remaining true to our own faith, learning from somebody else's faith, and also finding this commonality within and beyond our faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that so often there's a reason why, you hear stories about other faiths meeting together and the common bond always seems to be food,
Mm-hmm.
sitting down at a table, breaking bread together and sharing a meal. And there's
Mm-hmm.
something that's just uniting about that act.
Yes. Yes. And there are so many times, I mean, as you told your story and within our scripture, within scripture from other traditions as well, sharing that meal, that act that again, from our tradition, they recognized him in the breaking of the bread, that we recognize people for who they are as children of God in the breaking of the bread together and feeding each other is incredible. There was a Buddhist chaplain who invited me to. He was also had been a monastic before he became a Buddhist chaplain, but had invited me to the temple. I was serving at Joint Base Lewis McChord out in Seattle, and I had never been to dinner. And somehow I was able to sit at the table with these Buddhist monastics and enjoy a meal with them, where I think it was really forbidden for me to be there, but the grace that they offered me was just again something I'll never forget.
Yeah, you seem to have a talent for that. Like
Well, I think
getting
they do.
invited to places. Yeah. They obviously you obviously have a calming presence. They're like, yeah, she belongs here, man. Like, get her in here.
Or they thought, "Hey, she needs to calm down, so come to the
Either
monastery
way,
for a minute."
either
Yeah.
way, yeah, man, that's amazing though. And I think everybody given the opportunity should try to have one of those experiences. I didn't realize until I started looking just the number of temples in my area. And until I
Exactly.
started looking for one to visit, and yeah, all it took was an email. I said, "Hey, do you mind if I stop by?" And they're like, "Of course." The hospitality was amazing, so I highly recommend.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
any final words? I know we're getting towards the end here of our time. Any final thoughts? Anything that
You
you
know,
want?
I feel like I could go on for days, so I'll spare you of that, but I really appreciate the time that I've had with you. If any listeners out there are interested in military chaplaincy too, we always are looking for people from all kinds of backgrounds to serve, and it is a fulfilling vocation. So if it's stirring in you, maybe listen to it.
Awesome. Are there any links that I could provide that would send them in the right direction if they're interested?
Yeah, should I what's the best way of
Yeah, just send it to me and I'll make sure that I put them in the show notes so that people
Okay.
have access to it. So
Perfect.
awesome.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much. This is incredible. I knew it would be, like I said, just thoroughly enjoyed your sermon that you gave at our wonderful church. That was such a great gift to me. I know definitely shed a few tears throughout. So it was definitely very impactful, and I greatly appreciate it. So thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this.